At my son's engagement dinner, his fiancée picked up the ceramic bowl I'd spent 3 months making and handed it back across the table. "We're going for a very specific aesthetic in the new place," she said, smiling for the group. "I don't think this quite fits." She set it down in front of me like a returned library book. The table went quiet. My son reached for his wine glass. And that night, driving home with the bowl on the passenger seat, I had no idea that what she'd just dismissed in front of 12 people was the only thing in that room that actually belonged to her. My name is Iris Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and for the last 32 years, I've been a studio potter working out of a converted garage in Guelph, Ontario. I teach beginner classes on Thursday evenings to anyone who wants to learn. I've sold pieces at the Elora Gorge Arts Fair every summer since 1994. I know clay the way some people know music. By feel, by memory, by the particular resistance it gives you, when it wants to become something other than what you planned. My hands are cracked along the knuckles, and there's a permanent gray stain along my right thumb that no amount of washing has ever fully removed. I used to be embarrassed by that. I stopped being embarrassed a long time ago. My husband Harold passed 14 months before that dinner, 38 years together, and then a November morning, and then a house in Guelph that held 38 years of noise and had suddenly gone very still. Harold was a high school shop teacher for most of his working life. He built things: bookshelves, birdhouses, a canoe we took out on the Grand River, exactly once and never again. He made furniture the way I make pots, with the assumption that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing so it lasted. He didn't talk a great deal, Harold. He showed you things instead. The year our son Thomas turned 8, Harold started something I didn't know about for a long time. He opened a RESP, a Registered Education Savings Plan, not for Thomas, because Thomas's education was already covered, but for the grandchildren he assumed would exist someday. He did this quietly, the way he did most things. He set up automatic contributions, and he let it sit and grow, and he never mentioned it to me until the last weeks, when he asked me to bring him the folder from the bottom left drawer of his desk. The folder was thick. I hadn't known the account existed, which was classic Harold. He didn't tell you about a gift until it was ready to give. Inside was a statement showing 22 years of contributions and growth. He'd started it when Thomas was 8, because that was when Harold decided, in the way he decided things, that there would be grandchildren eventually, and they would go to university, and he wanted to have a part in that even if he didn't make it to see it. The balance was just under $63,000. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed and I looked at him, and he gave me that small, sideways smile. "For the little ones," he said, "whenever they show up." His voice was thin, but his eyes were clear. "Don't just hand them a check, Iris. Hide it in something. Make them find it. Something you make." He died 4 days later. I want to tell you about the bowl because you need to understand what it was before I tell you what happened to it. I started it 2 weeks after the funeral, mostly because standing in the garage with clay under my hands was the only way I knew to stop my thoughts from circling. I chose stoneware, the kind that fires dark and dense and lasts for generations if you let it. I worked it for 3 months. I made the walls thicker than I usually do, more deliberate, because I wanted it heavy in the hands. I glazed it in deep blue-green, the color of Georgian Bay in September, the color of the water Harold and I always said we'd retire beside someday. In the interior, near the base, I worked in a small inlaid detail, the letter H, in a slightly lighter clay, subtle enough that you'd miss it unless you knew to look. On the inside lip of the base, the flat underside, I built in a false bottom. It's a technique I learned decades ago from a potter in Stratford who used to hide small notes for her grandchildren inside her pieces. The cavity was small but deliberate. Into it I placed the res-escape transfer documents and account information, folded tight, sealed in a waterproof sleeve, and a letter. Harold had dictated it to me from the hospital bed the week before he passed, stopping to gather himself between sentences, making me read each paragraph back to him. The envelope was addressed in his handwriting. He insisted on holding the pen himself. For our grandchild, to be opened with the money. I sealed the false bottom with a thin disc of unglazed clay, fired separately and fitted so cleanly you couldn't feel the seam unless you pressed along the base with your thumbnail. Then I glazed over it. The bowl looked whole. It was whole in the truest sense. It contained everything Harold had wanted to pass forward. I wrapped it in brown craft paper and brown twine, and I drove it to the engagement dinner in the passenger seat, which is where I always put things that matter. I should tell you about Courtney, because I don't want her to be a caricature. She's 29, my son's fiancée, and she's the kind of person who has a very clear idea of how her life is supposed to look and has worked hard to make it look that way. She grew up in North Vancouver in a family where appearances were load-bearing. Her mother, Diane, has opinions about dishware. Strong opinions. The kind that get expressed at dinner tables while the subject of those opinions is sitting right there. Courtney isn't mean. I want to say that clearly. She's defended the way people are when they've been taught that the wrong aesthetic marks you as lesser. When she looked at my bowl, she didn't see 32 years of craft. She saw something her mother would have called homespun. She saw something that didn't match the kitchen she'd already planned in her head. She handed it back to me without cruelty, which somehow made it more complete. The engagement dinner was at a restaurant in Kitchener, the kind with small plates and lighting that costs more than it gives. My son Thomas had booked a private room. 12 people. His friends, Courtney's parents, her sister, a couple I'd never met. I was the oldest person in the room by 15 years, and I was aware of it the way you're aware of a draughty window. Not painful, just present. The gift opening wasn't a formal part of the evening. It happened naturally, the way these things do when someone noticed the wrapped parcel I'd set beside my chair. Thomas said, "Mom, what did you bring?" And the table turned. I carried the bowl over to where Courtney was sitting. I said that I'd made it myself, that I hoped they'd find a use for it. I was about to say more. I'd planned to say, "Look at the base, there's something inside." But Courtney had already lifted it, turned it once in her hands, and then placed it back on the table in front of her with a particular kind of care that isn't care at all, the kind that means I've decided. "It's really beautifully done," she said, and the word really did all the work of but. We've been very intentional about the aesthetic for the new place, though. Clean lines, very minimal. I think this is more of a... She paused, looked at her mother. Diane tilted her head. "It's more of a statement piece." Diane offered, "The way you say something is a statement piece when you mean it doesn't fit." "I wouldn't want it to get lost in a drawer," Courtney said, and she lifted it and set it gently at my end of the table. "You should keep it, Iris. You made it. You'd appreciate it more." And there was the laugh, the table laugh, the polite one that says, "Yes, that's settled, moving on." And Thomas, my son Thomas, smiled his careful smile and said, "She's been very specific about the apartment, Mum, and that was the whole of it." I looked at the bowl sitting in front of me. I looked at the base, the sealed base, with Harold's $63,000 and his last letter folded inside it. And I thought, she doesn't know. Nobody at this table knows. And the camera wasn't running. There was no Brooke filming, but 12 people had just watched my son agree that his mother's gift wasn't good enough for the kitchen, and that was its own kind of record. I didn't say anything. I picked up my fork, and I finished my dinner. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment, because it's the reason everything that followed was possible. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because in the 3 seconds after Courtney set that bowl in front of me, 3 things became very clear. 1. Harold's gift was still sealed inside it, and she hadn't found it and wasn't going to unless I told her. 2. My son had just chosen easier in front of 12 people, and he knew it, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that he knew I knew it. 3. There was no version of this evening where announcing actually there's $63,000 inside that bowl would feel like anything other than a transaction. Harold had said, "Hide it in something, make them find it." I was going to honor that exactly. Just not tonight. I drove home with the bowl in the passenger seat again. At the stoplight on Speedvale Avenue, I talked to Harold the way I sometimes do when I'm driving alone. "Big night," I told him. She didn't like it. I could almost hear him. "Did she find the base?" No, then it's fine, Iris. The bowl's still whole. He was right. The bowl was still whole. I got home and I set it on the kitchen table, and I made tea, and I sat with it for a while in the particular quiet that comes after something hard. And I thought about what Harold had asked for, and I thought about what Courtney had shown me, and I thought about Thomas and his careful smile and his easy agreement, and I made some decisions. The first decision. Courtney's name would not be on the receipt transfer. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because you don't hand an unlocked inheritance to someone who didn't know to look. Harold had saved that money for a grandchild. The grandchild would have it. When the grandchild existed and was old enough, and there was a family that understood what the money was and where it came from, it would go directly and irreversibly to that child. In the meantime, I moved the accounts. I went to see a financial planner in town, a woman named Nothing. I'll share here, who was matter-of-fact and efficient, and helped me set up a formal trust structure, the kind that required court documents and an independent trustee, and couldn't be touched by anyone until the beneficiary was 18. I named the beneficiary as the first biological grandchild of Harold and Iris Calloway. The trustee was my sister-in-law, a woman who had loved Harold for 60 years and who would have walked through fire to make sure his wishes were honored. It cost me a few $100s in legal fees, and it cost me, a little, the feeling that I was trusting my son. I won't pretend that didn't sting. But Harold's wish wasn't trust Thomas. Harold's wish was make it last, and the cleanest way to make something last is to make it impossible to bend. The second decision. I was going to make them open the bowl, the right way, with the right people, in a room where the truth could land and stay. Thomas called me the next morning. He opened with, "Mom, I'm sorry about last night," which was more than I expected, and then immediately softened it with, "Courtney just has very specific taste, you know how she is," which was less than I needed. I said that was fine, and I asked if I could have the family for dinner the following weekend. Just us. He said yes. I could hear him relieved, assuming I'd accepted the explanation, assuming it was over. It wasn't over, it was just beginning to be arranged. The people I wanted in the room, Thomas, Courtney, her mother Diane, because she'd been there and her laugh had helped, and my sister-in-law. 4 other people, my kitchen table, Harold's old Windsor chairs, home court advantage, pot roast in the oven, because some things are strategic and some things are just what you make when you want people to feel fed before they feel anything harder. Courtney came in wary. You could see it in the way she scanned the room when she arrived, looking for the shape of things. She'd been polite on the phone when Thomas told her about dinner. She was polite at the door. She was a very well-trained polite. Diane was quieter than she'd been at the restaurant, which told me Thomas had said something on the way over, which told me more about Thomas than he'd probably intended. My sister-in-law arrived early, the way she always did, and stood at the counter while I finished the gravy and said, "Iris, he would have loved this," meaning Harold, meaning the whole situation, the slow, careful way it was resolving. "I think he'd have found it funnier than I do," I told her. She said probably, yes. We ate, I insisted on that. The food first, the hard thing after. I asked Courtney about the apartment, because I was genuinely curious about what she was building. And she was genuinely animated talking about it. And for 20 minutes, around the pot roast, I let myself like her. Because the truth is, you can dislike a thing someone did and still like the person underneath the doing, if you look past the armor. Then I cleared the plates, and I brought the bowl to the table. I'd carried it in from the living room shelf, where I'd placed it deliberately, in view but not mentioned, when they arrived. I set it in the center of the table where the salt and pepper usually live, and I put my hands flat on either side of it. "I'd like to show you what I brought to your engagement dinner," I said. My voice was even. I'd had a week to find the register I wanted, and I'd found it. Warm, unhurried, not unkind. Not what you thought I brought. What I actually brought. Courtney went still. Thomas straightened. Diane looked at the bowl the way you look at something you've already dismissed and are now being asked to reconsider. I took out my potter's knife. A small one, barely 2 inches, for detailed work. And I turned the bowl upside down on the cloth I'd laid on the table, and I began carefully separating the false bottom from the base. I'd refired the bowl after the dinner, sealing the seam even more cleanly, so that the opening now required the knife. I did it slowly, on purpose. Let them watch. "Courtney," I said, working, "you held this bowl the other night, and you decided what it was worth. I'd like you to know what you were actually holding." The false bottom came free with a small sound, barely audible. Inside, the folded waterproof sleeve, dense and thick, and the envelope in Harold's handwriting. I set them on the table between us. "Those," I said, touching the sleeve, "are the transfer documents for an ERISC-PEP, a registered education savings plan that my husband Harold started 22 years ago. He opened the account when Thomas was 8 years old. He contributed to it through every bonus and every good year for 2 decades. He never told me it existed until the last weeks of his life." I unfolded the statement and laid it flat on the table. "The current balance is $63,412. The number did what numbers do in a quiet room. It moved through everyone at a different speed. Diane's hand came up to her mouth. Thomas's chair shifted backward without him meaning it to. Courtney went very pale. "And this," I said, lifting the envelope gently, the way you'd lift something you'd been keeping safe for a long time, "is the last letter Harold ever wrote. He dictated it to me in the hospital. He held the pen for the address himself. It's for our first grandchild, to be read when they're old enough to understand where the money came from and who saved it for them." I touched the envelope. Harold's blocky printing on the front. "For our grandchild. Open when you're ready." Harold's instructions to me, with his dying breath, were, "Hide it in something handmade. Make them find it. Make it last." I looked at Courtney, and I kept my voice as level as the surface of a well-thrown pot. "That is what you handed back to me at the restaurant. $63,000, and the last words of a man who spent 22 years getting ready for a person who doesn't exist yet." Nobody spoke. Courtney did what I had expected Courtney to do. She reached, quickly, for the version where she had not been entirely wrong. "I didn't know," she said. "How would I have known? You didn't say anything. You can't just." She stopped. Started again. "If you'd told me what was inside." "If I'd told you," I said, "still even, still warm, still unhurried, you'd have held it differently. Harold wanted it held differently, because it deserved to be. Not because it had $63,000 inside it. He wanted the bowl treated like something precious before anyone knew about the money, because that's the only honest test of how someone values a thing." I paused. "It's not your fault you've been taught to look for value in the wrong places, but the looking is something you do, Courtney. And I need you to know what the looking cost, in this case." Diane started to say something. I turned my eyes towards her. "Diane." One word. She closed her mouth. Thomas hadn't spoken since I'd laid the statement on the table. I looked at him now, my son, in Harold's old Windsor chair, with his hands wrapped around his coffee mug and his face doing the complicated arithmetic of what he'd allowed the week before and what it had meant. "You said that's just the way she is," I told him, not harshly. "About me, about the bowl, about the whole evening. You've been saying versions of that for 3 years about things that weren't small. I'm not angry at you, but I need you to hear me. The bowl survived because I went home and kept it. The money is safe because I kept it, not because you said anything." Thomas put the mug down. He looked at the bowl. He looked at the envelope. He said, "I know, Mum." Just that. But in a voice I hadn't heard from him before. Flatter, heavier, like he was saying something he'd been carrying a while and had finally set down. Then I told them what I'd decided, because consequences and mercy can occupy the same kitchen table. Harold had taught me that without ever using those words. The money was going into a formal trust for the first grandchild, administered by my sister-in-law, locked until the child was 18. It could not be touched by either of them, not for a down payment, not for renovations, not for anything. The child's and only the child's, the way Harold intended. I watched Courtney's face when I said locked, and I watched Thomas absorb that the locking included him, and I watched him not argue about it, and that, more than anything else that night, told me something had shifted. "The bowl comes home with me tonight," I said. When I believe it's going into a home that knows what it is, you'll have it. Not before. Courtney looked at the bowl. For the first time since she'd handed it back to me at the restaurant, she was looking at it the way it had always deserved to be looked at. Not assessing, not calculating, just looking, she said quietly. The blue-green. Is that Georgian Bay? And I understood that Thomas had told her about our retirement plan, the one we'd never taken, and that she'd remembered. Harold's idea, I said. He picked the color. She didn't say anything else. But something in the room had changed its temperature. There was one more thing. The most important thing. Harold had written a short note to be read aloud on the day the family learned about the gift. He'd been that deliberate about it, that certain the moment would come. I took the smaller envelope from my cardigan pocket. My hand shook a little, and this time it wasn't the arthritis. He wrote something for this room, I said. He didn't know it would be this particular room. But here we are. I opened it and I read Harold's words aloud in my kitchen in Guelph on a November evening, with his old chairs under us and the smell of dinner still in the air. If you're hearing this, then the little one is on their way, or already here, and I'm sorry I'm not there to be useless at the hospital and embarrassing at the birthday parties. I started saving when Thomas was 8 because my own grandfather put $20 in a savings bond the year I was born. And I never forgot the feeling of finding out someone had been thinking about me before I was a person. That's what's in this bowl. Proof that someone was getting ready for you before you existed. Spend the money on something that lasts. Learn a trade or study what you love or build something. It doesn't matter what, and whatever else you do, learn to look past what a thing costs to what a thing is worth. Your grandmother knows how. She'll teach you if you let her. All my love, Harold. My sister-in-law was crying openly. Thomas had his face turned toward the window, and his shoulders were very still in the way that means a person is working hard to stay together. Courtney had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the bowl and not looking away. I folded the letter. The hard part was done. I softened, the way you let a kiln cool, slowly, deliberately, not all at once. I didn't do this to humiliate you, I said to Courtney. And I meant it. I did it because someday there will be a child in your house who is going to need to know that the most valuable things don't always come with a price tag. Harold saved for 22 years in secret because he wanted to be part of that child's life, even if he didn't make it to see it. The bowl is how he was going to arrive. I rested my hand on it. A thing isn't less real because it doesn't match the kitchen. Thomas spoke then, and he spoke to Courtney, and he didn't look at me when he said it. I should have said something at dinner. I knew it was wrong the second it happened, and I let it go anyway. He paused. That's not the last time I'm going to say that. Courtney looked at him. Something passed between them that I wasn't part of, which is how it should be. The interior of a marriage belongs to the people in it, not to the mothers watching from the doorway. But I saw her reach over and put her hand over his, and I took that as a thing worth noticing. I served dessert. Because the evening wasn't over, and you don't end these things on the hard note if you can help it. Here is what happened in the months after. The trust is established and growing. $63,000 sitting in a locked account doing exactly what Harold designed it to do. Waiting patiently, which is the thing Harold did better than anyone I've ever known. The child doesn't exist yet, but the account does, and when the child arrives, the account will be there, compounding quietly, the way Harold thought about everything. Thomas is different. Not transformed, that's a television word, but different in the small daily ways that actually mean something. He calls more often. He asks questions about my work, the real questions, about what I'm firing and why. He told me last spring that he'd started building a small raised planter box for their balcony, with wood from a place on King Street that sells salvaged lumber, and that he'd watched about 40 YouTube videos first, and it had taken him 3 weekends and it looked, he said, like something an enthusiastic child built. He sounded proud. He sounded exactly like his father. Courtney asked me in February if I would teach her to hand-build a small piece, not on the wheel, hand-building, where you work the clay directly. We spent an afternoon in the garage. She was impatient and then she wasn't. She made something that looked, charitably, like an ashtray. She took it home and told me a week later she'd put it on the kitchen windowsill. She didn't mention the aesthetic. Diane and I are not close and probably never will be. But she sent me a note after that November dinner, handwritten, on notepaper, that said she was sorry for her part in the restaurant evening. It didn't say much else. It was enough. The bowl lives on my mantelpiece for now. I told Courtney it would go to their home when I felt it was ready, and I've been watching quietly. The way you watch a new piece come out of the kiln. Assessing, taking your time, waiting for the temperature to settle before you decide what you're looking at. Last month, I drove out to visit them in the new apartment. She'd sent me a photo in advance, which I thought was deliberate of her. The kitchen is everything she described. Clean lines, very minimal, lovely in its own disciplined way. And on the shelf above the stove, in a place of real prominence, was a single object. The small, lopsided hand-built piece from the garage. The ashtray that wasn't an ashtray. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed, and she could see that I noticed, and that was the conversation. I'm making them a wedding gift. A large serving bowl this time, wider, more open, designed to be used rather than looked at. Inside the base, nothing hidden this time. Just the clay and the glaze, and the letter H pressed lightly into the underside where you have to turn it over to find it. Harold's mark. Mine to carry forward. My hands are not getting better. Some winter mornings I have to sit at the kitchen table for 20 minutes with them, wrapped around a warm mug before they'll close around a tool. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so you understand that every piece I make now is a decision, and every decision is a kind of statement. This matters enough. I make things because making things is the language Harold and I shared, the one we taught Thomas, the one I'm trying now to teach Courtney, the one that will reach a child we haven't met yet in the form of a trust document and an old man's letter and a bowl that survived because someone knew to bring it home. Harold said, hide it in something, make them find it, make it last. He didn't mean the money, he meant us. If this brought back something handmade that someone made for you, something you still have or something you wished you'd kept, say so in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe if you want to stay for more of these, and I'll see you next time.